Australia, much like the United States, has reached a moment in which to be proud of being Australian or to show any spark of patriotism is seen as alt-right. How are we going to move on and improve the lives of all citizens, regardless of their backgrounds, if we are not united by a positive sense of self?
Paul, it's an interesting question from Zoe, but do you accept the premise that to express patriotism is to belong to the alt-right? Is there a place for patriotism that is not hijacked by a particular...
I think there's a lovely aspect of love of country, but when it turns into a nationalistic sort of fervour, or it's... and often with patriotism, I've always sort of been a person that's been offended by people wrapping the Australian flag around themselves. I don't know why that is. I just find it a bit of a statement.
Would you feel comfortable to say, I am a proud Australian?
I'm a proud Australian, yeah. And I think we have a gift of a country here. It's an extraordinary country. And, but, of course, there are the dark forces that are moving within this country at the moment. And I think there's been massive influence from America over the past, 10 years. And we do have a growing problem, but it's not just in Australia, it's globally, with the alt-right. I find them unbearable because they don't allow thoughts, and they're not comfortable with differing opinions. So it's a very belligerent and aggressive tone that I think a lot of the alt-right adopt with people.
Nakkiah, we've been talking a lot about critique of the West and the baggage of the West, and I was just wondering what are the things about the West that inspire you, that you're proud of and that are worth preserving?
Stan, I'm not answering that question. Like, I don't think that the West is at any risk at all of anyone because a few people get up and criticise some of its great works of art and go, hey, this is a little bit offensive. I feel rather marginalised and I don't feel like I have a place in this society. Maybe we should, reconsider whether you, how we look at this work. I don't think that's... I think that question is quite divisive. But we live in the West every single day. And speaking of what you're saying, Paul, would I call myself a proud Australian? I'd call myself a proud First Nations person. I'm on land that was never ceded. This land is not a gift. It was land that was stolen because homes were destroyed and people were killed. So gift from the West, I don't know what you want me to say to that other than be like, hey, it wasn't so bad that invasion happened. However, in saying that, going to the question that was asked by that young lady, in terms of, I think so often we look at our backgrounds as being a hindrance to some type of equality, and that in order to be a good Australian, you have to forget about your things like your gender, your race, your culture. Anything that makes you different is somehow an obstacle to being a good Australian. So I would question, when we go, the spirit of nationalism, what is that nationalism? Who does that person look like that we're all meant to be celebrating and replicating? But I'm not going to answer what I think is great about the West. But that's like being like, oh, well, you're lucky we gave you iPads. Look at you on your Facebook with your dissent. No, I'm not answering.
It's not what's great about the West, but to go to Bri's point about holding two views at the same time, is it a fact that a Western tradition that is complicit in empire and colonisation and genocide and the things you've talked about is also something that has created liberalism, democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of speech? Are those things not worth preserving? But have they created it, though? The question is, I wouldn't say that people are trying to stop freedom of speech because we are wanting to engage with our freedom of speech. You can't on one hand go, there's a whole marketplace of ideas, and then when some people then use whatever platform they have to argue with those ideas, go, the marketplace is rigged and you're cancelling us. That isn't fair. And I don't think that, this idea of modern history, democracy, it's the names that we freedom of speech, are this inheritance of Western culture that does a real disservice to all of the cultures that weren't impacted by the West and what preceded them. I think that within Aboriginal culture, that's a big generalisation, so I'm sorry to probably my parents who I offended saying that. But you look at all the different tribes, all the different nations, they all have their own values. So to think that thought originated from one particular race at one particular time is so incredibly ignorant to me. But of course I think people are capable of duality. I think more than
any time where we're wanting to, especially, you know, with the pandemic that hit, our capacity for empathy, our capacity to want to get to know our neighbour, just because we get upset at each other and we have dissenting opinions doesn't mean we're not capable of thought or we aren't well fleshed out human beings. Like that is like, I just find that question really, like, that's a little bit divisive.
And that goes to your book, actually, Tim, doesn't it? Because you're talking about how we have just these types of conversations with all of the historical legacy, with all of the contradiction, with the philosophical thought that gave birth to this, that is problematic, as you've already pointed out. So how do we do this?
I think this is a good example of how we do this. We sit and listen to each other. But what makes it really difficult is we can hold two ideas at once, but we're not very good at it. We're much better at holding one idea. And not only just holding one idea, we're much better at holding an idea that others someone. So we've got a negative who we can push back against. And that can kind of help reinforce and buttress our identity. And I mean, talking about like the marketplace of ideas, I used to really be a believer in the marketplace of ideas, right? I used to teach critical thinking and, hey, everyone, if we can just do some better Venn diagrams, we can have some better conversations like this. And I realised it wasn't working because all I was doing, the students were weaponising this stuff to have bad conversations, to have bad arguments by throwing fallacies in people's faces or finding a way to kind of bring them down and win an argument. And I think what I've learnt a lot in the last few years, and particularly through writing the book and looking at human nature and looking at how we create our identities and how identity is so much socially constructed and how we create these others and the difficulties of us kind of getting out of some of that in-group, out-group kind of thinking is we also really need to figure out how to listen better and listen better in a way that can validate and genuinely understand how someone feels. And this is a journey for me, right? Because I don't experience discrimination. I'm kind of right bang in the middle of privilege. So I've learned a lot by actually listening a lot more and understanding those feelings. And that's a separate conversation to the content and the theories and the arguments and the facts and all that kind of thing. But we've got to get better at that listening phase because I think what that does, the foundation of any good disagreement is social capital, trust, and respect and affection and the glue that can bind us together and the bridges that we can build between communities. And so when I teach critical thinking now, I don't talk about this kind of marketplace of ideas thing where we've just got to put out better arguments. I talk about how to listen better, how to hear people, how to validate feelings, how to build that trust, how to express a little bit of vulnerability, to go on a journey together to understand something rather than just trying to win an argument.
What about when people aren't coming? It seems like what you're saying completely, like, very insightful, completely agree. But what if, it seems like it's on the assumption that people are coming from the same place of equity.
Or good faith.
Yeah, in good faith.
Yeah.
How do you respond to when, like, people have different amounts of equity? You know, like, how does that, you know, what's a bad argument in a context where people are necessarily maybe not being heard and don't have the power to be heard? Look at the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, you know what changed my mind about the marketplace of ideas was...
I just threw that out there.
When I started... Well, it featured a lot in my more naive kind of philosophical thinking.
Not believe in that.
Is when I really started to factor in power and how power changes things, and that's what you're talking about in terms of equity and different voices and marginalisation. And suddenly all of that work that philosophers have done for thousands of years trying to get to the moral truth suddenly just looks hollow because where were they coming from? What positions did they have? What power did they have?
Can I just come in and just to bring it back to Zoe's question and the implication of that question that somehow it is wrong to express a patriotism. The ideas that you're talking about, that the plurality of ideas and the ability to have discussion, is that not rooted in just the type of thinkers you were talking about before, the David Humes of the world, the Enlightenment thinkers? Is that not a Western inheritance?
Yeah, there's an element where, for most of human history, you were born into a moral community and you didn't choose. You didn't get to choose your social role, you didn't get to choose your power, you didn't get to choose what you agreed with and disagreed with and liked. And there have been varying degrees in some communities of allowing diversity, but really the push through liberalism, the push through John Locke and people like that was to say, We are now at a scale of society where big groups are bumping into each other with different views and they're killing each other over it. I mean, people have been killing each other over these things for a long time, but the scale of it was so great. We need some different ways of thinking about this. Their way of thinking wasn't perfect, but what it did do is introduce an idea of diversity and tolerance as being a norm rather than eliminating diversity and tolerance.
Hence, we can have this conversation.